Hey guys, as you are streaming in, could you just say hi in the chat so I can see that everyone has access? Great.
Welcome to Science Fiction Writers Week. Before we get started, here's some important information about the week. During the week, you can chat with other participants, ask questions of speakers, share key wins and takeaways in our online community. To find the community, go to community.prowritingaid.com. You can find session times, session descriptions, and all replays on the Science Fiction Writers Week Hub. Navigate to a session and hit the drop-down arrow beside the title to access a replay. You can find the link to the hub in the chat or in any of the emails we're sending throughout the week. Replays are available for everyone until September 9th. If you want continued replay access, you can upgrade to Pro Writing Academy for 50% off during Science Fiction Writers Week. In addition to the software integrations and editing suggestions available to free and premium users, the Academy tier includes access to live training intensives led by best-selling authors, hundreds of on-demand video workshops and exercises, and weekly accountability check-ins, among other things. Our first live training intensive begins September 5th and is led by Jessica Brody, the #1 best-selling author of Save the Cat Writes a Novel. This training intensive includes on-demand training as well as live sessions with Jessica every week. To learn more about Pro Writing Academy and access your 50% off discount, click the link in the chat. We're just about ready to get started. Remember to use the Q&A button to ask questions of our speaker during the session. Thank you for coming, and we hope you enjoy this session.
All right. Hi, everyone. So we're at the end of day 3 of Sci-Fi Writers Week. For this session, we are joined by Savannah Gilbo. She's an editor and book coach who helps fiction authors write, edit, and publish stories that absolutely work. She's also the host of the top-rated Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast that you can tune into wherever you normally listen to podcasts. So today, she'll be discussing how to create three-dimensional, compelling characters for your story. Over to you, Savannah.
Can everybody see me? Oh, there I am. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's training. It's going to be all about crafting the perfect dynamic between your protagonist and your antagonist. I think everyone's on, so I always plan to give people a few minutes to jump on, but I think we'll skip that today. Have you guys been enjoying the presentations? I got to see a few on Monday and Tuesday, and they were awesome. I love them. I love that we're able to dedicate a whole week to science fiction. So thank you to Pro Writing Aid for hosting, and thank you all for showing up today. While we wait to start, I just want to let you know I created a handout for today's training that goes along with what we're going to go over. You can download that at savannahgilbo.com/PWA. And that will be available after the training. So if you guys want to watch and work through your answers later, that's totally fine. Maybe make a note of the web address on your screen if you want to grab it later. And let me see, I'm gonna turn my screen off because we're gonna, you know what? I'm sorry, you guys, it's not showing on the, I see you in the chat. It's not showing. Here, hold on one sec. Can you see me now? Okay, I'm sorry, you guys. My fault. So that's the web address if you want to grab the freebie. I'll leave that up for 1 second. Okay, so in case we've never met, I just wanted to quickly introduce myself. I'm Savannah Gilbo. I'm a certified developmental editor and book coach, and that's really a fancy way of saying that I help people write, edit, and publish stories that work. I'm also the host of the top-rated Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast that you can check out wherever you normally listen to podcasts if you've never tuned in before. And lastly, I am the creator of the Notes Novel course that walks fiction authors through crafting a compelling first draft without the stress and overwhelm that stops most writers in their tracks. So that is a very quick summary of who I am and what I do. I did not include pictures today, but I also have 3 amazing puppies that are usually underfoot as I give these presentations. You can see them on my social media if you would like. Now, speaking of social media, something I really like to do after one of these trainings is jump on social media, specifically Instagram, and see all the posts you've done throughout our time together. I like to reshare your posts on my page and just kind of brag about you and give you all the attention. So if you would like a little shout out on Instagram, and if you want to show me where and how you're tuning in from, or if you want to show me your dog or cat or whatever kind of sidekick you have, post something on Instagram stories and tag me at savannah.gilbo. That way I can see all of your posts easily and share them on my page as well. So have some fun today, take some photos and tag me in them so I can repost them on my page. Sound good? Okay, so in this training, we're going to talk about how to craft the perfect dynamic between your protagonist and your antagonist. And the reason we're going to do this is so that you can write a story that engages readers until the very end. So here's how we're going to do that. First, we're going to talk about how to flesh out your antagonist. And we're going to start with your antagonist because this is a part of the process that I see many writers overlook, and then their story falls apart halfway through the process. After that, we're going to go through a similar exercise for crafting a compelling protagonist. And even if you think you've already done the work for this, just hang in there with me because there might be something in this section that triggers a new thought or a new idea. After that, we're going to look at our first case study. So we're going to look at The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins and see the relationship between the protagonist and the antagonist in that story. And we're going to see how they work together to create a satisfying tale. Then we're going to look at Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And I know it's sci-fi week, but I wanted to put this in here because the dynamic between Harry and Voldemort is one of my favorites. It's also a very popular story, so I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with it. After that, we're going to look at Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. I just reread this recently. It's one of my favorites. I know it's a little bit older, but I love it. So we're going to look at that story. And at the end, we're going to have some time for Q&A. So that is where we are heading. Now, like I mentioned, I'm going to show you how to craft the perfect dynamic between your protagonist and your antagonist. But why is this important? Well, stories are built on conflict. You've probably heard other presenters talk about this week, and that's because it is so very true and so very important. So the conflict between your protagonist and your antagonist is what builds your entire story and drives the whole thing forward. Without it, your story is going to fall flat, and it certainly won't keep a reader engaged. So having a strong and engaging conflict between your protagonist and your antagonist will help you to create an exciting plot that holds the reader's attention and keeps them turning the page. It'll help you to force or push or encourage your protagonist to grow and change and become a new version of themselves. And it will help you express a theme that will leave a lasting impression on readers for all of time. So, like I mentioned, we're going to start by talking about how to craft an antagonist. And we're starting here because, again, I see so many writers skip over this part or only take the time to flesh out their protagonist without properly considering their antagonist. So we are going to walk through 5 questions that will help you flesh out your antagonist. But first, let's just make sure we're all on the same page about what an antagonist is and what their purpose is in your story. And we are going to go through this quickly because I'm sure many of you know this, but just in case we have some new writers, we're going to get on the same page. So your antagonist or your story's antagonist is the obstacle between your protagonist and their goal. Their primary function is to oppose the protagonist and create conflict that will eventually force your protagonist to grow and change. But of course, they don't know this, right? They're just a character who, in their own opinion, is living a completely normal life. And they don't have to be bad or evil. They don't even have to be human. They're just an opponent to your protagonist. So in case you haven't identified who your antagonist is, here are some questions that can help you narrow in on that person. Which character creates the main plot problem or central conflict? Which character or thing will your protagonist have to face in the climax? And which character can help you best express your story's theme? Usually the answers to all of these questions point to one person, and that's probably the best candidate to be your story's main antagonist. From here, we can flesh out our antagonists with 5 key questions. Number 1, what does your antagonist want? So just like your protagonist, your antagonist is going to be defined by what they want. If they don't want anything, or if they're not trying to do anything, they won't have any reason to get in your protagonist's way, and your story will lack conflict. Now, there are 2 different goals you will want to consider in regard to your antagonist. First, what do they want before the story starts on page 1? Because like I mentioned earlier, the antagonist will probably start the story really unconcerned by the protagonist. They're going to be living their life, going about their own goals and projects and things like that, totally unconcerned with the protagonist. So you'll want to understand what they want before the protagonist steps onto the very first page. Which brings us to the second goal that you will want to think about, and that is, what does your antagonist want once your antagonist comes into the picture? So in many cases, whatever your antagonist wants at the beginning of the story will be what they still want once your protagonist comes into the picture. But sometimes their goal might change, and if it does, that's okay. We're going to see examples of that later on. But either way, your antagonist goal needs to be specific. A problem I see all the time is that goals for the antagonist and even the protagonist are too vague. So if your antagonist has a goal that's something like he or she or they want to rule the world, that is vague. So who do they want to rule specifically? What do they want to rule? And what does this actually mean? So readers should be able to either say, yes, the antagonist succeeded, or no, the antagonist did not succeed by the end of the story. It should really be specific and clear. Now, like we said, it's possible that your protagonist and your antagonist will begin your story knowing nothing about each other, right? But they will still be obstructing each other, or they should be from the very beginning, in ways that they don't understand and in ways that readers won't understand until later in the story. When the characters and the readers look back on your story, they should be able to see that the main antagonist was in play from the very beginning in one way or another. And this is why it's important to consider what the antagonist wants and what they're doing before your protagonist shows up on page 1. So that is question number 1. What does your antagonist want? Question number 2 is, why does your antagonist want to achieve or accomplish that specific thing? And this is one of my favorite questions when it comes to developing an antagonist, because I think it's fun and fascinating to think about things from their perspective. Your antagonist motivations are very, very important. They can actually make or break your entire story. To find out what is motivating your antagonist, you can ask questions like, what outcome is this person trying to avoid? How does this person justify their beliefs and actions? And even what kind of change do they want to see? In many cases, your antagonist's motivation will come from their backstory or their past. So you can spend some time digging into their past if you need to. Do some free writing or journaling from their perspective to figure out what makes them tick, what's motivating them to do what they're about to do. This is definitely an exercise that's worth spending your time on possibly before you develop your protagonist, but definitely before you write or edit your first draft. And this is important because if your antagonist motivations are weak or unconvincing or even overcomplicated, then your story is going to feel the exact same way. This is also what causes stories to break down in the middle of a draft. So give me a yes in the chat if you've ever been writing a story and it breaks down about halfway through or even in the beginning of the middle. I think it's probably happened to all of us, and it's one of the worst feelings. Okay, I see lots of yeses. I see me. Yep. I think it's been all of us at one time or another. So an antagonist with unknown or weak goals and motivations is in most cases the cause of this. So you do want to spend some time here, because again, this can make or break your entire story. And again, we're going to look at examples, so don't worry, this will, gel later when we see those examples. But that's question number 2. Why does your antagonist want what they want? Question number 3 is, what is your antagonist plan for getting what they want? And this one is also really important, because a lot of us understand that our stories need conflict. And I see this happen all the time. A lot of writers will spend time figuring out what that conflict looks like. but they come at it through the lens of their protagonist. So they're so deep in crafting a story focused on their protagonist that the conflict the protagonist has to face ends up feeling manufactured or inorganic, because it is, right? It's not coming from a natural place. So they usually start to come up with reasons for the antagonist to block the protagonist's plan, which sounds good in theory, but it creates a plot that doesn't feel organic. So instead, I would like to encourage you to brainstorm what your antagonist wants and why, like we just talked about, and then think about the micro steps that they might take to get whatever it is that they want. And then you might naturally start to see how your antagonist goals could interfere with your protagonist's life and their goals. This creates a situation where two people are naturally pitted against each other, and this is what helps you plot your story organically. I see a lot of love for antagonists and villains in the chat, so I love that. I like that you guys are so interested, because I am too. I love the villains in books and movies. So anyway, this is how conflict works in real life, right? The person who's in control or who instigates the conflict, which is your antagonist, they're not planning their actions around the other person or, making sure that it all fits in a nice box. They're just going after their goal the way that they want to. The reactive person, which is your protagonist, in the beginning of the story, often through the middle, they're going to be bombarded with events and chaos that's outside of their control. And then from there, they're going to struggle against the antagonistic force to bring their life back into balance. So just like that, you have an organic conflict between two people who are, deeply invested for solid and personal reasons in making sure the other person never gets what they want. So this is where your plot starts to develop. So I see this happen with a lot of the writers I work with, but if you're used to planning your conflict by deciding, what your protagonist or what you want them to do, and then deciding what your antagonist should do back, then you're plotting the cause and effect from scene to scene in the wrong order. Or I shouldn't say wrong, I hate that word, but an order that's not conducive to using your time the most effectively. Okay, so not only will this create a less than solid plot, it's also going to make your job a million times more difficult. So anyway, that's why question number 3, or what is your protagonist plan for getting what they want? That's why this is really important. Now let's talk about stakes, which is question number 4. So what is at stake for your antagonist? What happens if they succeed in getting what they want? And what happens if they fail? Stakes are what motivate characters into action. And in most cases, what's at stake for your protagonist is also going to be at stake for your antagonist. This is just the nature of genre fiction. So if you know your story's content genre or what type of science fiction story you're writing, you are already going to have your answer. And I know that I think it was Rochelle and Anne from Pages and Platforms. They gave a great presentation on content genres. So if you didn't hear that one, definitely go listen to it and figure out what type of science fiction story you're writing. But as an example, in an action story, it usually comes down to the fact that only one person can survive, right? So it's either your protagonist or the antagonist, which means their lives are both at stake. In a mystery or crime story, the criminal risks being exposed and brought to justice. In something like a romance, the protagonist and the antagonist can either gain or lose love or intimacy with another person. So, and again, I'm sure the Pages and Platforms ladies talked about this, but this is why knowing your content genre or what type of science fiction story you're writing is super important, because you could be writing a romance set in space, or an action story, whatever, set in space. Or dystopian world, whatever we want to do. So you might already have some ideas or insights into this question, because maybe part of the stakes came up in question number 2 when we talked about what's motivating your antagonist. But just in case it didn't, you will just want to flesh this out. Okay, so the last question, question number 5, is what is the thematic significance of your antagonist? And this is a really important question. I think it is probably my favorite. A lot of writers don't realize that their antagonist is a great way to express their story's theme, but they really are. Your antagonist is a great vehicle for expressing your theme because they drive the external conflict in the story. The external conflict is a metaphor or it causes the protagonist's inner conflict. So what I mean by this is that your antagonist is someone who, just by their very existence and by the goals they pursue, they're going to push on your protagonist and make them face their inner conflict or their inner wound. Because of that, your protagonist and the conflict they create must directly tie to your theme, because that's how your theme, or that's how your character's inner journey is expressed through your story's theme. We're going to talk about this more in a few minutes and you will see examples. So if that doesn't make sense yet, don't worry. Just keep this high level topic in mind, that the theme of your story is tied to the inner conflict, and the antagonist creates that external conflict that then creates the internal conflict. So we'll go there more in a second. Now, if you come up with specific answers to these 5 questions, this will help you develop a compelling antagonist. So here they are again at a glance. If you want to screenshot this slide, what does your antagonist want? Why do they want this? What's their plan for getting it? What's at stake if they succeed or fail? And what is the thematic significance of your antagonist? So remember, we are working towards creating the perfect dynamic between your protagonist and your antagonist. So this is just one side of the equation. While I grab a quick drink of water, just want to remind you the handout that I made that goes along with this can be found at savannahgilbo.com/PWA. I'm going to grab a drink. Let me know in the chat how you guys are doing. I see no chat comments, so I'm guessing everybody's okay. You do not need this guide right now. Just wanted to remind you because I knew that I was going to need a break to grab a sip of water. I am the person that presents. If you guys have seen me present before, you know that I tend to lose my voice, so I try to drink a whole lot of water. Okay, there, I see you guys in the chat now. Okay, so let's dig into how to craft an equally compelling or protagonist. I put this section second because some of the work that you do to develop your antagonist will help you answer the questions that are going to come up in this section. But again, before we go there, let's just make sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. So what is a protagonist? A protagonist is a character whose fate is most closely followed by the reader and who is opposed by the antagonist. They are the person who makes key decisions and experiences the consequences of those decisions, whether their consequences are good or bad. And this is really important because the number one thing we want our protagonist to have is agency. We do not want a passive protagonist. Protagonists are often the character who learns a big lesson throughout the story. So we kind of talked about this already. That lesson is what helps you express your story's theme. Now, you might already know who your protagonist is, but just in case you don't, here are some questions to help you narrow in on that person. Which character has the most at stake, so the most to either gain or lose? Which character has to deal with the main plot problem or the antagonist? And which character can help you best express your story's theme? Usually these answers are going to point to the person that is the best candidate to become your protagonist. If there's time in the Q&A, we can talk about what to do if you have multiple protagonists. I know that's a question that comes up. So if we have time, we'll go over that. Now, let's see. Okay, so once you know who that person is, you can ask 5 questions. Again, similar questions to the antagonist, but a little different. And these are deep, specific questions that'll help you get to the heart of who your character is and how we create that dynamic. So the very first one, again, is what does my protagonist want? What is their specific goal? And this is important because in real life, we all want something, no matter how big or small it is. And to be realistic and 3-dimensional, your protagonist needs to be the same way. They need to want something. Plus, a character who wants something bad enough is going to pursue it or take action towards getting it, which is what's going to help you create your story's plot. So let's talk about character goals because there are a few things you'll need to consider. First, what does your protagonist want before the story starts, before readers meet them on page 1? Why are they currently unsatisfied, and what do they think will make them satisfied or happy? The second goal to think about is what will become your protagonist's overarching story goal after they engage with the main conflict, or what will become their story goal after the inciting incident kicks the plot into gear. And again, if you already know the type of story you're writing or the content genre of your story, then you might already have an answer. So, for example, in an action story, the protagonist's goal is going to become to save the victim or victims and stop the antagonist. In a crime or mystery story, the detective's goal will be to catch the murderer and bring him or her to justice, or the criminal. In a romance, the protagonist will want to feel worthy of love and they'll want to avoid rejection. So again, hopefully you know what type of sci-fi story you're writing, because then you can take the general genre specific goal and personalize it based on what you already know about your protagonist. Once you know your character's overarching goal, you can then come up with smaller goals that they'll need to accomplish to achieve their main story goal. These smaller goals will become your protagonist's scene goals. And we're going to talk about this more in a second. You don't have to have this all figured out right now. I just want to get the gears turning. So let's pretend you're writing a horror story set in space. In a horror novel, if we say the protagonist's overarching story goal is to defeat the monster and survive, one of his or her smaller goals could be to find more about one of the monster's weaknesses so they can eventually defeat it. So just an example. Question number 2 is, why does your protagonist want to achieve or accomplish this goal? What is motivating them to go through all of this effort to accomplish this thing? And just like we talked about earlier, strong character motivations are important because they help readers relate to your protagonist, because we all know what it's like to want something, no matter how big or small or exciting it is. But beyond that, motivation is what gives your protagonist agency. So it's what makes a character take action towards a specific desired outcome. And again, this is what's going to help you start to develop your story's plot. Motivation, you can usually express this in a sentence like, my protagonist wants this specific goal because, and it's whatever follows that because that is most likely your motivation. To find the motivation, you can ask questions like, why is your protagonist willing to endure hardship and chaos to get what they want? What kind of change do they want to see in the world? And then what do they fear, or what outcome are they worried about? So sometimes journaling just about these 3 questions can help you unearth their motivation. And if you don't give your protagonist a solid reason or a strong motivation to go after what they want, your story is not going to make sense to readers, and it's not going to feel authentic. Because again, we all have goals and we all have motivations, even if they look different. So your character just won't feel real. But that's question number 2. Why do they want this thing? Number 3, we kind of talked about this a little. What is your protagonist's plan? So what are the steps they will take to start achieving their goal? And it's really important that your protagonist is the one that's kind of making decisions, making plans, and driving things forward, because we want them to have agency. And again, this will just help us create a plot. If your story is filled with coincidences or a bunch of just random things that happen to your protagonist, your scenes are probably not going to add up to a cohesive narrative, and your story is going to feel random. So this is really important. Your character needs to be the one driving things forward, and they need to have a plan, and they need to have the agency to enact that plan. So that's question number 3. Question number 4 is, what's at stake for your protagonist? So again, what do they stand to lose or gain if they are successful? And this is genre dependent too. So in an action story, we kind of talked about this earlier. We know that probably both the protagonist and the antagonist's lives or safety is at stake. In a crime or mystery story, justice is what's at stake. So the protagonist is trying to get justice for a wrongdoing. In a romance, love or intimate connection with another person is at stake. So use your genre as a guide and then tweak it based on the specifics of your story. And speaking of specific, we will always want to be specific with our answers to each one of these questions, because if the stakes are not concrete and specific, readers are not going to feel the weight of them as much as you want to, and they want to feel that. Now, another thing I want to point out, we talked about earlier how when you get into writing scenes, your character is going to be taking action toward pursuing the goal that they came up with. And they're going to have to make choices and initiate actions to move forward towards accomplishing that goal, right? With each one of these choices or actions, there should be something at stake, something to lose or gain. And if you don't set up your scene choices this way, It's going to be hard for you to show readers what kind of person your protagonist is. It's going to be hard to force or encourage or push them to grow and change. And it's going to be hard for readers to feel interested because it's almost like, what's the point of reading if there's nothing that I need to worry about? So that was question number 4. Question number 5 is, what conflict will your protagonist face? So this is our first question that's different from how we would develop an antagonist. And the reason this is important, if your story could automatically achieve their story goal, you would have nothing to write about and your story would be a little boring. Not only that, but the protagonist that faces zero conflict is unlikely to change. And that is a big factor in what readers come to fiction for. We want to see change. We want to see how people deal with hard circumstances. In general, there are 2 main types of conflict to consider. So there's external conflict and internal conflict. External conflict comes from outside the character. So it's who or what that's standing in the protagonist's way in the outside world. So it's the external obstacles that make up your plot. And most of these obstacles will come from your antagonist. So if you've already done the work to flesh out your antagonist, then you already know what type of external conflict your protagonist will face. This is also genre dependent too. So in an action or horror story, you're going to have an antagonist that is up to good to keep away from others. In a thriller or a crime story, there's going to be conflict coming from the criminal or the killer. There might also be shapeshifter characters who work to undermine the investigation and things like that. In a romance, this would be your protagonist's eventual love interest. This could also be anyone that tries to stand in the way of a romantic relationship or societal rules that keep them apart or anything like that. So you might have a few different sources of external conflict. And if you do, that's actually a really good thing, as long as your antagonist is providing the majority of that conflict. I see in the chat, Chris said Dracula was just misunderstood because he had different goals. Okay, well, let's talk about internal conflict. Internal conflict comes from inside the character. So it's whatever they bring to the story, both emotionally and intellectually. This could be anything from self-doubt to an outdated worldview, a wound from their past, or anything like that, as long as it comes from within your character. Whatever it is, your protagonist is going to have to face this internal conflict and overcome it in order to succeed in achieving their external goal. So let's say that you're writing a romance novel set in space, and maybe your character doesn't believe that she deserves true love. That means that she's going to have to overcome this false belief, this outdated worldview, in order to accept true love in her life. And this probably means you're going to need to dig into your protagonist's backstory a bit too, to find out where that wound comes from, and what that wound is. You can ask questions like, what is this character's greatest fear? What do they think will bring them happiness? Or what do they believe? Or what worldview do they need to let go of? And this is important because everything that has happened to your character before we meet them on page 1 is going to affect how they show up to the plot problem and how they deal with what's happening in the story present. So a quick example of that is, let's say your character developed an outdated worldview in childhood. That outdated worldview will still be affecting them as an adult if they have not overcome it yet. So if they were abandoned by their father as a teenager, they might have issues with men or authority in the story present. If their mother took them for granted their whole life, they might take other people for granted now, things like that. The inner conflict that your protagonist faces, we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, it's going to be directly tied to your story's theme. So this is why it's super important to develop your antagonist alongside your protagonist before you start drafting. If you only flesh out your protagonist, then like we talked about, it's likely that the external conflict they face will only be indirectly related to your theme, if it's even related to your theme at all. If it's not related, the result's going to be a disjointed story that doesn't seem to add up to anything. So it's just going to be a story without a point. And the heart of our themes are always going to be nestled within the comparisons and the contrasts between our protagonist and our antagonist. The more similarities there are between the two, the more opportunities you're going to have to explore and develop your theme. And the more your characters will present and prove your story's core message or theme to readers. And you'll see what I mean by this in a second when we look at our case studies. But this is the key to developing that perfect dynamic we're looking for between a protagonist and an antagonist. So if you answer those 5 questions in a specific way, you will be well on your way to crafting a solid protagonist. And as a very quick recap, here they are. What does your protagonist want? Why do they want this? What is their plan for getting what they want? What's at stake if they succeed or fail? And then what external and internal conflict will get in their way as they pursue this? Okay, so our first case study is The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, and we are going to run through those 5 questions for both the protagonist and the antagonist to see how they compare and contrast. Are you guys excited? This is my favorite part of the presentation, so we're going to geek out. Okay, yes, I see lots of yeses. Great. Okay, so the first question is, what does Katniss want? So at the very beginning of the story, Katniss wants to keep her family fed and safe. That is a simple and relatable goal, right? That's her page 1 goal. After Prim gets selected as the tribute and after Katniss volunteers to take her place, her goal then shifts and it becomes all about surviving. So very on genre. It's an action story. So action stories are all about survival. What does President Snow want? He's our antagonist. At the beginning, he wants to maintain control over all the districts in Panem. After he sees Katniss volunteer to take Prim's place and he sees the effect that she has on the people and the hope that she inspires, Snow does not want her to survive the games. So notice how these 2 goals oppose each other. Katniss wants to survive and Snow does not want her to survive. You can already see the organic conflict that's built in here, right? And can you imagine how if you develop a protagonist like Katniss without understanding who the antagonist is or what they want, it might be hard to create this kind of symmetry with their goals. Question number 2, why does Katniss want to survive? Well, she's motivated by survival. We all would be, right, in her shoes. She's also motivated by the need or the desire to protect her mom and sister. She does not like the Capitol controls the districts through violence and fear, and we know she's not one to back down from a threat. So, her motivations are pretty easily understood. And yeah, I see some questions in the chat. Totally subjective. We're all going to take a little bit different things from this. So, if you disagree, that's totally fine. Just try to look at what we're talking about between the similarities and the differences, just as you can use it to help you craft your own protagonist and antagonist. Okay, so it's okay. No worries. You guys discuss the differences. That's totally fine. Why does Snow want this? So Katniss represents hope and rebellion. And if she wins the Hunger Games, the people of Panem could rise up against President Snow and ruin everything he's worked for. So he needs to kill Katniss to prevent it. That's what's motivating him to his goal of not letting Katniss survive. What's Katniss's plan for survival? Well, she is going to train before entering the arena, and once inside, she's going to follow her mentor's advice. So some of that includes going straight for the bow, hiding until the initial killing is over, and things like that. There's a lot of different goals, but these are just kind of the high level ones. So later on in the story, she develops a plan with Rue to destroy the career tribute's supplies. So those are like the high level important things she's going to do. What is President Snow's plan? So his plan is to use the game makers to destroy Katniss inside the arena. The longer she survives and the more creative and ruthless, or the longer she survives, the more creative and ruthless he has to be to defeat her. So he sends in attacks that are specifically targeted at Katniss. He changes the rules of the game and things like that. So notice how President Snow's plan creates conflict for Katniss to deal with on a scene-by-scene basis. And this is why I personally like to start developing the antagonist first, because doing that will help you develop conflict that's organic and natural for your protagonist to face. So what's at stake for Katniss? Well, if she doesn't find a way to win, she will die. And if she dies, her family back in District 12 will be even worse off than they already are. What's at stake for President Snow? If he does not kill Katniss in the arena, she will become an inspiration to the people of Panem. He will probably lose control of Panem and he will probably be killed. So either way, there's a possibility of death, and there's a possibility that each of the characters' worst case scenarios will come to life if they lose. So good stakes there. Now, what conflict does Katniss face? So externally, there are 23 other tributes. Well, let me back up. Number one, she faces President Snow, right? There are 23 other tributes also trying to kill Katniss in the arena that is literally designed to kill her. So that's one thing. Notice how President Snow causes this external conflict. So the question, sorry, let me back up. Katniss, the internal conflict for Katniss is she doesn't want to kill people or become a symbol for change. She just wants to survive and go home. So now when we look at what is the thematic significance of Snow, we're really asking, how does the external conflict that Snow provides directly cause Katniss's internal conflict, forcing her to morph, right? Or change. So President Snow, he's the face behind the message of the oppression, and he controls people through violence and fear. His actions are what push Katniss to become a symbol for change and rebellion by the end of the story. So without President Snow taking the actions he does to keep Katniss down and to ideally take her out of the Hunger Games, she would not develop into the face of change and hope and rebellion. So there is a direct link between President Snow and the external and the internal conflict Katniss faces. And this is the best way to create a powerful dynamic between your protagonist and your antagonist. So we're going to move on to the next example, which is Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. So we're just going to do the same thing. What does Harry want at the beginning? He wants to survive the summer holidays until Dudley goes off to school. After he learns that he's a wizard and he, learns there's this grubby little package and all that, he wants to keep the stone safe and keep it away from Voldemort. What does Voldemort want? At the beginning, he wants to acquire the Sorcerer's Stone. After Harry gets in his way, he still wants the stone, but he also wants to put an end to Harry once and for all. So their goals are actually the same. They both want the Sorcerer's Stone, but their motivations are different. So let's look at that. Harry wants to prevent Voldemort from getting the Sorcerer's Stone and ultimately coming back to power because he wants to stay alive and he wants to keep Hogwarts and his new friends safe, right? Why does Voldemort want the stone? Voldemort wants the Sorcerer's Stone so that he can come back to life in full power. He does not want to die. He wants to live on and shape the world according to his vision. So notice again that their motivations they're in opposition, right? So this is going to cause some good conflict. Harry's plan to keep the stone safe, he's really on a fact-finding mission from the very beginning of the book. He has to figure out what that grubby little package is that Hagrid took from Gringotts. He has to figure out what the three-headed dog is guarding and all of that fun stuff. He also has to find out who Nicholas Flamel is because apparently he has something to do with the Sorcerer's Stone. So Harry believes that if he can find out the answer to all this, then maybe he can find out more about the stone and eventually he'll be able to prevent Voldemort from getting it, even though he thinks it's Snape right through the story. But we're looking at this through the author's perspective, so we know it's Voldemort. What is Voldemort's plan? Voldemort will use Professor Quirrell to help him find and acquire the Sorcerer's Stone. When Harry starts asking questions that get in the way, Voldemort instructs Quirrell to get rid of Harry, even if it means killing him. Which brings us to what's at stake. His life is at stake. If Harry does not prevent Voldemort from getting the stone and coming back to full power, there's no doubt that Voldemort will eventually kill him because of that prophecy that says one can live while the other dies. So what's at stake for Voldemort? Well, in this book, if he does not get the Sorcerer's Stone, he will remain weak and ineffectual. He won't die yet because of the Horcruxes, but readers and Harry don't know that at the time of book one. And again, this is an action story, middle grade action with the fantasy setting. So the stakes are appropriate for the genre. Now, what conflict does Harry face? So he faces quite a bit of external conflict. I mean, number one, the antagonist is Voldemort, who's taking action through Quirrell, but also Harry doesn't know much about the wizarding world or how to do magic. And Professor Snape seems to hate him. Draco Malfoy bullies him all the time. and challenges him to do things that get him into trouble. And there are fantastic beasts and creatures on the school grounds that Harry's never encountered before. So lots of fun external conflict for Harry. The internal conflict Harry faces is that he basically has an outdated worldview that tells him he's not special. When he learns that he's a wizard, this is the first bit of new information that challenges that worldview. So, he's thinking, how can I be the same person who defeated Voldemort as a baby if I'm not special? This does not compute to me. He also feels a great longing for his deceased parents. So he's got a lot of good internal conflict going on. Now, what is the thematic significance of Voldemort? And remember, we're asking, how does the external conflict that Voldemort provides directly cause Harry's internal conflict? We know that Voldemort tried to kill Harry as a baby, so his actions are what singled Harry out and caused him to develop the reputation as the boy who lived. Because of that, Harry must rise to the occasion and embrace his destiny as the boy who lived in order to defeat Voldemort. He can't sink to the level of his day-to-day bullies like Snape and Malfoy, and instead he has to embrace the goodness within him and the power of love and all that. When Voldemort offers Harry a chance to reunite with his parents, he must sacrifice that dream to save other people. So only someone like Harry would be capable of doing so. Someone like Voldemort would not be capable of that. So again, this is the key to a great protagonist-antagonist dynamic. Voldemort causes both the external and the internal conflict for Harry, and they both have something worth fighting for, even if that something looks different for each one of them. So that's example number 2. We're going to move on to Ender's Game. Same question. So what does Ender want? Ender, at the beginning, he wants to be normal like everyone else, except for his brother Peter, who's very violent. When he gets the opportunity to go to the battle school, he wants to train hard and he wants to defeat the buggers. I have Colonel Graff as the antagonist because he pushes on Ender the most to change. You guys might disagree. That's okay. We could kind of maybe say the buggers are the antagonist, but we know if you've seen the movie or read the book, we know they're not actually bad. So what does Graff want at the beginning? He wants to find the child capable of leading the international fleet. After meeting Ender, he wants to train hard. He wants Ender to train hard so that he can eventually defeat the buggers. So again, notice how they both actually want the same thing. Why does Ender want to train hard and defeat the buggers? Well, part of Ender's motivation is that he wants to live up to his purpose. So he was born a third in a world that has a 2-child maximum, which basically resulted in he's been signed away to the military at a young age. He wants to survive the threat of the buggers and stop them from killing the human race because he doesn't want to die and he doesn't want everyone else to die. Totally relatable, right? Why does Graff want what he wants? Well, Graff believes that destroying the buggers once and for all will result in humanity's survival. Again, relatable. So they both kind of want the same thing for the same reasons on the surface. What's Ender's plan for getting what he wants? Well, he's going to train hard and he's going to climb the well-defined ranks at battle school to prepare for war with the buggers. What is Graff's plan? So Graff will isolate Ender from the rest of the students because he believes that Ender must be tested and that he must learn to rely on himself if he's to become the commander that they all need him to be. So what's at stake for Ender if he doesn't do well and if he doesn't defeat the buggers? Well, if he doesn't do well, he's going to be iced and he's going to be sent back to Earth where he will live the sad life of a third. Also, he believes that the buggers will come back soon or someday to destroy the human race. So his life is at stake. What's at stake for Graff? If Ender doesn't become the one to lead the fleet against the buggers, he believes that they will attack. This will result in a loss of life for Graff and possibly all humans. So again, similar stakes, right? Everything, their lives literally depend on Ender doing well and climbing the ranks of battle school. Now, what conflict does Ender face? So Graff provides a lot of conflict. So does Mazer Rackham. I think that's the right name. When he comes into the story, he's kind of the other mentor. But the older kids also bully Ender because he's younger, and the game battles that they fight, they become harder and harder because that's how they're designed to make these kids better. Internally, he struggles with the idea of destroying the buggers if it's the right thing to do. if it's moral, all that, right? Especially as he learns more about them. So what is Graph's thematic significance, or how does the external conflict that Graph provides directly cause Ender's internal conflict? So Graph's thinking is very black and white. He thinks it's either the buggers or the humans, and he will use violence to preserve humanity no matter what. And that's not really the same way that Ender would handle this if he had a choice. He does not want to be a violent person. Graph pushes Ender to become a super soldier, but his actions also cause Ender to question whether they're doing the right thing, especially as he gets to know his enemy or the buggers a little bit more. So again, this is what makes a protagonist and an antagonist pairing work so well. When the antagonist directly causes the majority of both the external and the internal conflict, and when both the external and internal conflict push the protagonist to grow and change. So, do you see how the differences and similarities between your protagonist and antagonist can help create organic conflict? And do you see how fleshing out your antagonist and your protagonist's reaction to them can help you generate ideas for your plot? And do you see how the antagonist actions can push on your protagonist to face their internal wounds and to grow and change? If you're saying yes, then you now know how to craft the perfect dynamic between your protagonist and your antagonist so that you can write a story that engages readers until the very end. So Q&A time, I think we have about 9 minutes. Let me know if that's right. I see we have some questions. So I don't know if Ashley, are you going to come back on and let me know what we want to do about that?
Okay, so you want me to field questions to you, or do you want to go through the question and answers?
I can go through them if that's okay. Let me see if I can pull them up.
That's definitely
Okay.
fine. And I know that we have like 9 minutes left, but if
Okay.
you want to go a little bit over, that's fine.
Okay, I'll just try to go really fast because I know that you guys have probably have things to do. Okay, so let's see. The first one is Chris. Can you have more than one antagonist or use them or have them use another character to interfere with things? So yes, definitely. We saw that with Harry Potter. I will say, because we were going to talk about this earlier, right? What happens if you have more than one? I have 3 things I always recommend for the writers I work with. Make sure they're connected in some way. So make sure they're in a relationship together, make sure they have their fates bound together, or this is for your antagonist, they face a common form of conflict. So if we look at Harry Potter, there's multiple antagonists, right? There's Snape, Draco, Voldemort, Quirrell, however many people you want to list. All of them are connected through the school. Snape and Harry are connected through the teacher-student relationship. Malfoy and Harry are students together, things like that. And I know that might sound silly, but I've seen a lot of drafts where there's multiple antagonists and they're not very connected. Like it's like, protagonist goes to this town, faces a antagonist or conflict, and then they move on to the next town and that antagonist isn't connected to anything. So it's just something to keep in mind. Okay, what if the antagonist knows, this is from Janine, what if the antagonist knows the protagonist prior to the story? I think that's fine. Let me know if there's a specific reason why you're answering that. King says, is it okay to have the protagonist appear first and the antagonist appear toward the middle? So yes, definitely, because it's the protagonist story, right? But like I mentioned earlier, there should be kind of like, I like to call them pre-shocks, like an earthquake. So like in Harry Potter, there are pre-shocks of Voldemort because Voldemort took action against Harry when he was little. In something like Ender's Game, Ender is feeling the effects of the international fleet and the buggers just by being a kid who lives on Earth. So you do want to make sure, even if the protagonist shows up first, which they usually will, that we can, in hindsight or from the author's perspective, you can see the effect of the antagonist on the protagonist's life. Okay, so what is your opinion? This is from Leah. What is your opinion on story building one antagonist for the entire thing, but in the end it's revealed to be someone else? So this is like Harry Potter, right? It's just a twist ending. I would say just to make sure that you're planting the seeds of plant some red herrings, plant some true clues. And at the very end, when the reader goes back, they're like, oh, this makes total sense because all the information was there. So what you don't want to do is just make it come out of nowhere and there are no seeds to it. Just keep that in mind. Let's see. Leah says, what is your opinion on the antagonists who want to see the world burn for no reason, simply because they want to? So those aren't my favorites. I love a more complicated, more complex antagonist, but you do what you want to do. Nicole says, do you write fiction? Yes, I do. I write fantasy. I'm working on a fantasy series. King says, will we be able to download your slides? Yes. So I will send those to the Pro Writing Aid team and they will put those up on the website for you guys. Mary, why do most people lump fantasy with sci-fi, yet to find a good book or web that deals with fantasy? So probably because of the world building aspect. If you caught the Pages and Platforms presentation earlier in the week, they talked about content genres, and that's something I subscribe to as well. So fantasy or sci-fi, historical fiction, whatever you're writing, they all need to have a content genre. So you could write a romance that takes place in historical times. You could write a romance in space, in a dystopian world, in a fantasy world, whatever you want. But the construction of the story, no matter what kind of your story you're writing, probably follows similar guidelines. And for fantasy sci-fi, the world building just kind of always gets them lumped together. But I'm trying to think. We have to find a good book or web thing that deals with fantasy only. Watch the Pages and Platforms presentation, because I know they talk about sci-fi, but you can use it for fantasy. How do you test to see if the antagonist motivations are weak when it's in line with the theme? So if you know any other writers that you can bounce these things off of, definitely do that. You also try to make it as specific as you can. So like we talked about earlier, wanting to rule is vague. Who do you want to rule? What do you want to rule? What area do you want to rule? What does ruling look like for you that it might look different for somebody else? Just dig specifically into it, and then it probably won't be weak. And then to test it, if it's in line with your theme, we can use something like, let's see, I'm thinking of the Hunger Games for an example. So the antagonist, we talked about his motivations. How do we check if that's in line with the theme? So what is the theme of the Hunger Games? Like, what does it take to survive? We could say it takes standing up to bullies. Maybe President Snow, we could think of him like a bully. And Katniss is brave. She takes chances. She takes risks. So, how does your antagonist, how does someone like President Snow show the opposite of that? He is not necessarily taking risks or chances. He just wants to control everything. So you just kind of want to think how it's related. I hope that helps. Let's see. I'm going to just scroll down because we only have 3 minutes. So Emily says, does the protagonist need to experience internal conflict throughout the story? In most cases, I would say yes. There are certainly things like Sherlock Holmes or Mission Impossible, James Bond, things like that, where the protagonist doesn't really change, but it might be like, I'm just thinking of Sherlock Holmes. Maybe this plot tests everything he knows and the skills he brings to the table. So it's not necessarily he has a wound, but it's like, maybe this is the hardest thing I've ever dealt with in terms of my skills. So that becomes kind of internal conflict. Okay, let's see. It's that one. Janine says, many people consider superpowers to be sci-fi or fantasy, not sci-fi. What are my thoughts? I think it depends what the superpowers are. And, I'd love to actually hear everyone in the chat. How do we think we differentiate sci-fi to fantasy? Because we know there's like technology in sci-fi. We know it's like future, what could happen in the future. Fantasy has magic. It's usually not related to what could happen in the future, although I suppose it could be. Let's see. Oh my gosh, 1 minute. Okay. I'm just trying to pick the best one. What Emily says, what if your protagonist has a goal that isn't clear how to resolve it, like ending dissension, conflict within their family? So I think this is where you kind of have to separate yourself from the protagonist. So you should have a clear idea of what you're trying to say about solving conflict like that. And if your answer is that there's many ways or there's not just one clear way, that's what your book should express. So your protagonist is most likely not going to know how to resolve the conflict at the beginning of any story. But us as authors, we should always know what that resolution is going to be. Okay, let's see. I'm just scrolling to see. I think so. We're at the hour. I'm just going to answer one more, and then we can sign off here. Let me see. Eric says, can the antagonist in book 1 evolve into the good guy by book 3? So yes, I mean, someone like Professor Snape does that. He's not necessarily the good guy, but he very well, I mean, he is a good guy, but he's not the protagonist / good guy. I think that could happen. That's fine. I don't have any examples off the top of my head. So, oh my gosh, I know, can we remind everyone where to put their questions? Because I see there's a lot more. I'm happy to come into the community later and answer questions. So if you guys have them that I didn't answer today, just bring them to the community and I will pop in there throughout the rest of the day and answer some. Okay, yeah, don't forget to join the community. Okay, so that is it for me. Thank you guys so much for coming. I don't know if Ashley, do you want to sign off for everybody?
Let me just drop the links a few more
Okay.
times. Everybody can see the link to join the community. Savannah has been so gracious to answer a few questions after this, but thank you so much, Savannah, for your time. Thank you for sharing your insights. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it, and thank you everyone for joining us. So until next time. Oh, and don't forget that the replay for this session, as well as all the slides, will also be posted on the hub, so you won't miss anything at all. Thanks for joining, guys. Thanks again, Savannah. I will see you all tomorrow. Bye.
Bye, everybody.